This is Tel Arad. And if you kind of look behind you, there's actually two places in Arad that we're going to visit. Just right over here near to us to the left is the Canaanite city of Arad. So when the Canaanites were here, that's where they lived. We're going to go there next after this. And then if you look up on top of the hill, that little fortress up there, that's Israelite Arad. So Canaanite Arad, Israelite Arad up on the hill. And so we're going to go to both of those places and talk about what was important about each of those and see some things. But I want to start here because we're still in the desert. And I just want to keep talking a little bit more about some of the images of the desert. We've seen the shepherd already, right? And the sheep and all of that. Well, there are desert plants and there are desert trees. So we're standing next to one of those desert trees. Does anybody know what this tree would be called except for Susie can't answer?
Yeah, I guess.
So go ahead, Jet.
My guess is a broom tree.
Okay, maybe a broom tree. Broom trees actually would be much smaller, almost like broom bushes.
Okay.
So brooms are a little bit smaller. There are also acacia trees. Those are desert trees, but this is not an acacia. This is what's called a tamarisk tree. A tamarisk tree. Or maybe if some of you are familiar with Arizona and the southwest United States, you might refer to it as a salt cedar. Maybe salt cedar, but here it's a tamarisk tree. So these are, I mean, obviously desert trees. So if you're going to be a tree in the desert, you got to have some special qualities about you to survive in the desert, right? You can't just be any old tree. So these tamarisk trees would often grow to be about 30 feet high. Obviously this one is not quite 30 feet. It's not really spread out yet, probably still growing, but they would get to be 30 feet high and kind of the tops would spread out a little bit. So where does a tree like this get water to survive? Well, there's water down there. Remember we're talking in the desert, there's a water table down there that all the water kind of rushes down here and you just dig for it and there's wells all over the place. So these tamarisk trees would send their roots down 160 feet. Wow. 160 feet down into the earth to seek out that water table down there, draw on it so that they could live. Obviously, a tree like this would be very adapted to the desert and also very tolerant to drought, right? They can seek out that water. Now, a tamarisk tree is a very slow growing tree. In fact, when you plant a tamarisk tree, it would really take 100 to 200, sometimes even to 400 years before it reached maturity as a full-grown tree. It's a very slow-growing tree. And the tamarisk tree, although not quite this particular one, but when it gets full-grown and spreads out, a tamarisk tree would be able to provide shade. In the desert. You think shade is something that you value in the desert? Here's Granny. How's the shade doing?
Love shade.
Right. So Granny's in the shade of this tamarisk tree, and obviously it would attract passersby. Tamarisk trees would attract the shepherds, who would maybe come and sit in the shade of the tree as they watch their sheep wander on the hills and so on. The tamarisk tree not only is shady, but get this, is cooler than other trees. I don't mean more beautiful, cooler. I mean air-conditioned cooler. Yeah. A tamarisk tree has its own air conditioning system in the desert. This is amazing. God put an air conditioner in the desert for the shepherds. Here's the secret. You want to hear the secret? Here's the secret to the tamarisk tree. So the tamarisk tree draws from the earth and the table, because you know we're at the Dead Sea and the salt and the minerals in this area. The tamarisk tree would draw out of the earth tiny little salt crystals that would be exuded onto the leaves of the trees. At night, the moisture would increase in the cooler air and the water vapor would adhere to those salt crystals that are being exuded into the leaves, and then would condense into droplets as those droplets adhere to the salt crystals. And then in the morning, what happens? The sun warms the air, evaporates, it cools, and there's an air conditioning system that provides. Now, if you don't believe me, come on up here, and if you want, you can stick your tongue on this leaf, and you will taste the salt. You can taste the salt. Go ahead. Tell me if I'm telling the truth. Oh, yeah. You gotta taste it. Just put your tongue on the leaf, and you'll taste salt.
Very interesting.
Did you get it, Kim? Did you get something more than salt?
A little bit too much.
So, yeah, take a drink.
We're gonna take a drink.
There you go. Look, there's Stephen. He's going to consume some salt. So, this is a really interesting tree, isn't it? A desert tree for the shepherd that God provides for shade, for cooling, for comfort, and all of that. This is a very important tree, everybody, for the desert and for a whole lot of other symbolic reasons. Let me just read one little passage in Genesis 21. Genesis 21, I'm beginning at verse 22. If you're following, I'm at verse 22. So it's going to mention this guy named Abimelech. And he's a king of one of these desert towns out here. And he's got a commander named Phicol. So Abimelech, Canaanite king of one of these towns, and his military commander Phicol. But who else lives in this territory? Well, Abraham. This is Abraham territory, Beersheba, the desert, the Negev. So Abraham is here with his sheep, Abimelech, and Abraham is encountering some of the Canaanites and the people who live here. And now here's a little story about that. Genesis 21, verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness that I have shown you. What are they talking about? Hospitality. Look, I've shown you hospitality. Show me hospitality. We're desert people now. That's what we do. And Abraham says, yeah, I know. That's what we're going to do. Let's continue. Verse 24, Abraham said, I swear it. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. So there's disputes about water, imagine, in the desert, right? There's still disputes about water in the desert. And so there's a water dispute about the wells. Verse 26, but Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today. Abimelech is sort of apologizing. Like, I don't know what happened. If it was my guys, I'm sorry about that. Verse 27, so Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech. And the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So they're making a sort of a covenant or a treaty or an agreement, and they're sealing it with these animals and so on, right? So the place was called Beersheba. So not right exactly right here, but Beersheba is a little bit further south, okay? They called the place Beersheba because the two men swore an oath there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. So apparently the agreement worked, right? Abimelech says, okay, you're right, these are your wells, and that's fine. I'm sorry we took them over for a little bit there. Mistake. We'll go back to the Philistines. Return to the Philistines, verse 33, important verse. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in the desert. Imagine that. Now here's my question for you. Why did Abraham plant a tamarisk tree? Any ideas?
Putting roots down.
Say,
Putting roots
okay.
down south.
putting literal roots down. That's a good one. I like that, Margie. You didn't realize the pun you just used there.
Survive.
Putting roots down for his family.
Survive.
Okay, it would survive, right? Yeah, that's good. That's good, Pete. Okay, a welcoming place. Abraham is maybe preparing to offer hospitality to others who pass by. Are you with? Yeah, you guys are good. That's all good.
Can it show where there's water, or do you have to know where there's water? to
Well,
plant it?
you have to kind of know where there's water. These trees can find the water,
Okay.
but yeah, it's a place where there's water, right? And that would identify that. Sure.
Place of sanctuary.
Yeah, it is. It would.
Multiple ways.
It's a safe place. It's a comfortable place. It's a place to sort of relax, right? And take sanctuary. Yeah, you guys are all good. I think first of all, it's a symbol of the covenant between Abraham and Avimelech, right? The animals were, but then the tamarisk tree is kind of a symbol of that covenant between those two people. Avimelech, I think, saw God's grace and favor over Abraham's life. After all, he said, God is with you in everything you do. So I think Avimelech recognized the grace of God in Abraham. And that's what I think caused him to make the treaty and the agreement that he did. Are you follow me? Salt was also a way of sealing a covenant. If you read the Old Testament, I don't have time to read all the passages, but it talks about a covenant of salt. Because it's the thing that preserves, right? It's a thing that has meaning. In fact, two parties who would make an agreement between each other in the Middle East would seal the deal by licking salt and saying to each other, there is now salt between us. And I will not break my word. There's salt between us. Are you with me? And so that's what they're doing. So I think it seals the deal between Avimelech and Abraham. But of course, it's also a symbol of the covenant between God and Abraham, this tamarisk tree. Because after all, God made a covenant with Abraham. And now Abraham, I think, is laying claim to God's promise. Abraham is saying, this is the land you promised. I'll plant the tree here as a symbol of the promise that you made to me, and also as a symbol of the obedience that I will give back to you, God. I trust that you are my God, and this is the land that you have promised to me and to my descendants, my children, and my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren, and my great-great-grandchildren, and my great-great-great-great-grandchildren. This is the land you promised. It's a family deal, God. And you made a promise to my family that you would be a God and a shepherd and a protector. And I'm going to give you obedience and faithfulness back to you, God. And I'm going to plant this tamarisk tree as a symbol of that now covenant between us. And this is as Abraham said to God, and God said to Abraham, now there's salt between us. But this tree, are you following me? Yes. This is good. I told you this tamarisk tree is a slow growing tree. A very 100 years, 200 years, 400 years. Abraham planted the tamarisk tree when he was 100 years old. Let me ask you something. Did Abraham plant this tree for himself? No. Absolutely not. No Bedouin, no Jew would ever say that you plant a tamarisk tree for yourself. That's not how it works. Who's he planting the tree for? Future generations. His son. Who's his son? Isaac. In the very next chapter. Very next chapter, Genesis 22, God's going to tell Abraham to take Isaac out and to sacrifice. Are you kidding me? The whole thing's going. That's another story for another day. But who does he plant this tree for? Isaac. His son. Jacob. His son. Judah. His son. And on it goes. Saying, I know that God has given us and my family this land. God has made a covenant with us and our family, a covenant of promise and faith. Is this an act of faith on the part of Abraham by planting this tree? Oh, you bet it is. It's a huge act of faith. The rabbis interpreted this. You know, they always have interpretations and comments on these things. The rabbis interpreted this and said that Abraham planted the tree so that someday Isaac could enjoy shade, and that his descendants would have a place to study Torah. Now that's obviously a rabbinic interpretation. I don't have the exact rabbinic. I can find it. If you email. But the rabbinic interpretation, right, much later on, is they're commenting on this story, and they're sort of looking back and saying, yeah, Abraham was a man of faith, and he planted that tree not for himself, but for his son Isaac, and for all his descendants, so that they would have a cool, air-conditioned place in the desert where they could sit and take comfort and sanctuary and go into the presence of God and study Torah and learn more about God to reflect his character. This is a family of faith. It's a legacy of faith. It's a heritage of faith. The generations that come after me. Are you following this? Mm-hmm. This is what's going on with this tree. Abraham is planting seeds of blessing that his descendants would reap. Let me ask you this now. What tamarisk trees are you planting? Some of you are thinking about it right now, aren't you? What choices are you making that will affect future generations? What faith are you forging and displaying and living out in front of your children, in front of your grandchildren, that they can look at you and go, yeah, Dad, Mom, I want that faith. You mean God made a promise to our family? You mean this is a family deal? I want that too, Mom and Dad, because you have it, and you showed it to me, and you lived it out in front of me, and it's attractive. I want your faith, Mom. You're a godly woman. You're a godly man, Dad. I want to follow that too, and I want your God to be my God, and I want to stand up someday and say it publicly to everybody. And I'm going to say it on that day. One of the things I'm going to say is, one of the reasons I'm here is because, Dad, it's because of you. Mom, it's because of you. Grandma, it's because of you. So, my oldest son, Nathan, graduate of Piper College, proud graduate, serving in ministry, married now, came on this trip, and also actually spent a semester at Jerusalem University College, one semester, and just loves this land. And his favorite part of the land, wouldn't you know it, has become the desert. And the reason is because he said, because it's your favorite place, Dad. You said you like the desert. I like the desert too. And so he was married to his wife Holly for about 3 or 4 years. And one day we got a knock on the door of our house, and it was Nathan and Holly standing on the door. I said, what are you doing here? It's like a random Tuesday night. Why are you here? And he said, well, can we come in for a couple minutes? And so they came in, we sat around the kitchen table, and then he said, Dad, I want to show you something. And out of a little bag that they had brought in the house, he pulled it out, and it was a little tamarisk tree.
Oh, sweet.
And he set it on the kitchen table, and he said, me and Holly are having a baby. You're going to be a grandfather, and you're going to be a grandmother, and we just want you to know that. And then they sat around our kitchen table and said, we want our kids and our son or daughter, whatever God gives us, we want to pass the faith that you gave to us. Thank you for giving us that faith. We have it in our marriage, and we want to live it out in our family. And when this baby is born and we raise this child, we want to have the same faith that you had in our family growing up. And of course, there was weeping for about 30 minutes. And then there was praying. And then there was praising. And now that little child that was announced to us that day is going to be 6 years old in a week's time. And by the way, her name is Georgina. You know, you can't name your grandkids. So we went to the hospital and said, "What's her name?" And he said, "Georgina." And I said, "No, seriously, what's her name?" And some of you may or may not know, but my father's name is George. They named her after her great-grandfather, Georgina. And it was just a way to say we want her to have the faith that you gave to us. Just, you know, do you do anything? Are you thinking of anything? Are you living out anything that will be a blessing to future generations? Will anything outlive you? Not your car, not your house. There's only one thing that may outlive you, that will outlive you, and that is your faith in Jesus Christ. And the way that you lived it out in front of your kids and grandkids. We're called to care for those who are entrusted to us. And what a trust it is. I know some of you students, you're the children. You're not the parents. But someday you may be parents, and God may call you and bless you with children. I don't know what His plan for your life is. But the most important thing to do is to live out your faith in a way that is going to bless others. This tamarisk tree was planted by Abraham, not for himself, but for others. What a trust. What a responsibility. It almost is too heavy, and that's why we pray a lot. Oh Lord Jesus, help. So I just want to give you a little time right now. We'll do this a couple times along the trip. Haven't done it yet, but 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. I just want you to maybe go off a little bit away from this tree, maybe alone, maybe as couples, if you're with a spouse. Just go off alone, just by yourself, and think about who God has entrusted to you. Your children, your grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren, and just maybe rededicate yourself to God, maybe affirm your faith. Think about ways that you want to go back and live out your faith in front of those children and grandchildren so that they can stand up someday and say, "Mom, Dad, this is it." Putting down roots just like roots. And then maybe you want to pray and thank God. But just take 5 minutes, okay? Go off just by yourself, not too far away, and then I'll